Hello, NG Houston. Are you muted? Are you muted? Okay, everybody. Okay, so we're live from Improving tonight, and it's a little bit tricky when you're not muted. I promise you're not. Maybe you're not. It's a little tricky live streaming in person because there's a lot going on.
Let's just make sure here.
There's Hangouts.
Hold on.
No, she's muted.
I muted that.
Okay, so we're live at Improving, so everybody say hello. I think I got everybody. Okay, and we have a couple of panelists to introduce, and we're super excited because Jesse's here. Jesse's cool. But first, Andrew, you want to introduce yourself? Andrew is the first-time panelist, so everybody say hi to Andrew.
Hey.
You guys are everybody, by the way.
Oh.
So, yeah, my name is Andrew Smith. I'm a developer at Smash.gg and currently going to be soon to be a developer at CollabNet. I am a craftsman. I speak and I mentor and I love unit testing.
Sorry, I should have planned that better because they couldn't hear you and we should have put you on there. Okay, but that's okay. Let's move on. we got Keith, you want to say hello real quick?
Hi everyone, I'm Keith, and sometimes I work this panel, sometimes I present here. I also work at CollabNet, where Andrew's about to start working as well. So.
All right, and now we have Jesse.
A little audio here. Great, we'll come back over here. Excellent. All right, everybody, thanks for coming out. My name is Jesse Sanders. I am your speaker tonight. We'll get into introductions here in just a second. I got a slide on me, but tonight we're going to talk about NgRx Jest testing, and we're really going to dig into Jest and why you might want to switch away from using Jasmine, Mocha, Karma, and really be able to accelerate what you're doing in the testing of your applications. So before we get started with that, the company I work for that I own and the CEO of is Breebug. So we're located in Denver, Colorado. We're a consultancy, and we work with companies by sending out teams of expert developers to help them work on largely Redux type of projects, mostly NgRx. That's pretty much what that says. You can connect with us. If you don't know, we've got a YouTube channel, so pretty much everything that we do, we record and we put out on our YouTube channel. A lot of great Redux content lately. Let's see here, a little bit about myself. So I'm the founder and CEO of Breebug. We've been around since 2009. A couple of our big clients are MapQuest, who's part of Verizon, and Aero Electronics. We've done a lot of work with them as well. Everyone else we work with are usually fairly small and companies you've probably never heard of. So I'm the organizer of the Rocky Mountain Angular Meetup Group in Denver. I was a speaker at Angular Mix this past October, spoke on NgRx Entity. Luckily, at the time I presented, the Entity library was not released yet. Luckily, 10 days later, they actually released it, and it's now available. We're going to take a look at briefly a little bit of Entity code tonight for NgRx Entity, but we're not going to dig in too deep. I'm a speaker at NgConf this year. I'm going to be doing a talk similar to this on Jest, but it'll probably be a lot more condensed. Also, we'll be digging into NgRx complex forms. Still working on that right now. So join us after the meetup if you'd like. We're going to go over to Sherlock's Pub, just a few blocks over here, and be an opportunity to hang out and socialize and have a beer, or just kind of get to know each other a little bit. If you have any questions, that's where I'll be at. And with that, we're going to dig into Jest. So Jest, does anyone know, or well, let's start with this. Is anybody using Jest right now? Wow, nobody. All right, cool. You've tried it. All right, great. So Jest was developed by the Facebook team in large part for React. And when it initially came out, from what I understand, is it wasn't so well received. It was very internal. It was kind of kludgy. It just didn't get a lot of traction, and there was actually a lot of negative about it. So when they rewrote it and did all this stuff to really improve it, it kind of fell flat for a little bit because everyone was like, oh, it's still the same old thing. That's what I've heard. That wasn't my experience because I never used it before. But Since then, what I'm noticing now is a really robust framework that allows you to write tests just like you're writing them right now, but then also making it a lot easier. And we're going to show you how tonight. So let's talk about the agenda tonight. What I want you to get out of this is, what is Jest and why would I use it? How do I install it? How much configuration? What is it going to take to actually implement this in my project? Is this going to be this new nightmare that I now have to maintain? How do I start to write some really simple tests? What are the basics of how does this work? We're going to dig into testing NgRx. So we're going to look at live code here on how to test actions, how to test our reducers, our effects. We're going to briefly touch on marbles, just briefly, so that we can test out our effects. We'll talk about selectors, and we might actually do some live coding. So those of you in the front, go ahead and sign the waivers now. If the thing explodes, whatnot. Yeah, because you guys, yeah, you know how easy it is to live code, right? And then we'll talk a little bit about upgrading tests and what it would take to actually convert your existing tests over. And we'll actually do a little bit of that probably as we go. So I love testing. Like, I think about my code and the stuff that I'm putting out there and how much I love, well, actually I love the idea of testing. Because in theory, it's great. I've got these automated tests and everything's, you know, every time I'm pushing up on my PR, I get some tests to run and I start some feedback. Am I doing well? Am I doing bad? Are things broken? And but the problem is that there's just never enough time. So I might have a little bit of time when I start writing the application, but then time sort of diminishes towards the end of the sprint or the end of the project, and we tend to release code that might only have, let's say, 50% coverage or 60% coverage. Let's say you get really lucky and you get it up there around 80, 90, or 100%. That's great, but then, you know, 6 months later, you go back to do a rewrite, or not a rewrite, a refactor, and then you go to run the test, and there's 200 broken tests, and it's due tomorrow. So there's a really easy way to fix that. And you just grab from here, comment down, comment all of it out, and now we have less tests. Now we just dropped from 80% coverage down to 70% coverage. And really we're degrading the quality of our applications. So what if I could tell you that with Jest, it'd be really easy to go back and refactor and be able to update 200 tests in a matter of an hour, maybe 2. And I wouldn't have to rewrite all my tests and make them super crazy in terms of like converting from Jasmine or Mocha to Jest. That actually the concepts that you already know and understand work out of the box for you. And then there's ways that we can then start to convert our tests so that we don't have to have all these expectations that are super complicated that we have to then remap or rework the logic when they change. So testing is hard. It does take a lot of time. Who's done protractor tests? Okay, who loves protractor tests? Problem I have with protractor is that it just seems like the more tests I write, the longer it goes. I've got tested across 2 or 3 browsers, and now what used to take, you know, an hour to run is now 3 or 4 hours to run. And now these things run in the middle of the night. And then I go ahead and check in a bunch of code. You know, at the end of the day, and I do my PR, and the tests are failing anyway on the end-to-end, so I don't really pay attention. And I don't even see the correlation between the tests or the code that I just checked in and the tests that are now failing. So to me, it's a failing way of doing testing. We need immediate feedback and not having tests fail intermittently. We need them to fail decisively, like, hey, if this has changed and this is no longer correct, that it's going to fail, and we're going to get that feedback right now. So as I said, refactors can break hundreds of tests. I've been there before where the number of tests just starts becoming astronomical. Like, oh man, I can't believe I broke these 200 tests. And it's a 3-day job just to fix them all. Who's been there? Like, had the massive, you know, refactor, and you just like, you're stuck, right? You got to get this all fixed, and maybe you have time, maybe you don't. But usually, for me, I don't have enough time. So let's talk about Jest. Jest is actually going to make your life a lot easier, and we're going to take away a lot of what you're doing in testing and simplify it. Just by nature, I find that NgRx and doing Redux type of projects simplify my tests anyway. So I'm moving the logic and the separation of concerns into actions, reducers, and effects primarily, and in selectors. And so I don't have as much crazy logic going on. I don't have to worry as much about doing mocks. So who's written mocks for their tests, right? Or spies, and with Jest, we actually make this super simple. So you don't have to write a whole bunch of spies. You can really just get it down to one line, like, hey, I just want to mock this one method. Boom, we're good to go. You don't have to maintain mocks and then have those, override the actual service being called there. So the installation here really as simple as just npm install save dev Jest. So if I do this just on a JavaScript project, I can now call Jest and I can run it and run it against a really simple application. So let's talk about configuration here really quick. When we talk about doing our typical test runner with Karma, with Jasmine Mocha, then we've also got Istanbul for coverage. We've got our Chrome launcher. We got our Karma config. I've got to go in and configure it, make sure that it's working the way that I want. And if I'm not doing what's out of the standard example or out of the box, it's a lot of work. And it's a lot of, usually for most people, it's a little bit of like back and forth trying to figure out like, okay, hey, is this really doing what I want? So Jest configuration is super complicated. There's none.
Even Istanbul?
You've got code coverage built in.
Good.
Code coverage is already built in to Jest. Now there's a bunch of other features that are built in as well, so I don't actually have to go out and configure it. Now if I want to modify a bunch of stuff, i.e. I want it to work in the CLI, we've got to do a couple things different, but I'm going to show you how easy that is to do. So here's the typical Angular CLI configuration. What I don't have on here is the first thing you need to do is anything that says Karma, you need to remove it. Anything that says Jasmine, go ahead and remove it. So if you go ahead and do an ng new, my fun project, it's going to go ahead and install Karma and Jasmine and whatnot. You're going to need to remove those. Otherwise, you're just going to start to get some type checking issues, especially there's the types library for Jasmine and the one for Jest, and they're so close that like VS Code will go, oh, well, yeah, everything looks pretty good up until this moment. And then it's not able to distinguish whether or not you're really wanting to use Jasmine or Jest. And so the only way you can get it to not error out is to remove the Jasmine library. So in our case here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to enable TS Jest here. We're going to install that. We're going to get our Jest types in. And then we're going to also add the Jest preset Angular and the Jest zone patch. So not a whole lot of pieces to install here. We're actually removing about, I think, 7 libraries between Karma and Jasmine and putting 4 more back in plus Jest, so 5. All right, so here's the Angular configuration. And I'll preface this with there are a couple of projects out there that allow you to do configuration just from an npm install, and then you're down to 2 lines in your package JSON to configure Jest to work with the CLI. Unfortunately, those only got me so far. So for right now, my recommendation to you is to go ahead and manually put in the Jest section in your package JSON, which with each one of these, and we'll cover this real briefly here. Because the problem is that without the ones that I've seen so far don't do the transform HTML piece. And so when you go to do the testing on your components, there will be no HTML. If you have a spec file for a component, it's going to blow up because it's not able to find the HTML. So it's something that I am getting ready to work with a couple of the authors on these libraries to see if we can get this to be supported so we don't have to do this. But in the meantime, what you have here is we have a setup Jest file here, and we'll take a look at that really quick. So we've got our globals for where the TS config spec JSON is. That's with the Angular CLI project. We've got our transform HTML. Here's what we're going to transform and what it's going to get basically piped out to the Jest preset Angular. Here's our test match. I like the .spec.ts, so I just go ahead and leave that. We've got our module file extensions, Jest.js, HTML, JSON. We want map coverage, and let's see here. We have coverage ignore. We don't want to look at node modules. Yeah, and then let's see here. We've got our module name mapper. And that one actually, I ended up having to remove. This is actually coming out of the NgRx example app, their package JSON. So that's actually where this configuration information comes from. So if you need to pull this into your own project, I would suggest just copying and pasting it. The module name mapper though, I ended up having to remove.
It's 1.6, right?
Pardon me?
It's 1.6 now.
I think you might be right on that.
No, RxJS.
Jesse, I want to know if you can say
Yeah, I know, right?
5 times faster.
No, I can't. I'm just going to give it up right now. You win. So we got two more here: the transform ignore patterns on node modules, and then our ignore patterns on dist. So again, this is just copied from the example app. I did have to make the one change of removing the NgRx DB part there on the name mapper. But other than that, it worked flawlessly. I was able to then start running my tests directly in the CLI. Before we get into that, though, actually, we've got one more slide here on the configuration. Is anyone familiar with JS DOM? Nobody? So basically, this is your headless Chrome, but it's not Chrome. It's just JS DOM. It's a JavaScript DOM engine for being able to test our components in. So we don't have any dependencies on Chrome or Firefox or IE or whatnot. So, and the problem here is that it does not have a transform property. So what it's doing here is it's actually just creating one. All right. So let's talk about testing itself. So we've talked a little bit about configuration. You can see that if you weren't using the CLI, your configuration would really just be 0. The only reason we have so much configuration there to deal with and put into the package JSON is just dealing with the fact that it's TypeScript and it's being transpiled, and we don't want to have it, include. We want it to include stuff in the dist, but we don't want to have code coverage in there, stuff like that, right? So fairly straight up. In this case here, I've got let's take a look at a test, and I've got a simple function here. Sum A and B, I can return A plus B, and I'm just exporting that function. So no real magic here. And now here's my test. So I'm going to go ahead and require in sum, and then I declare a test. There's my description, my big arrow, my fat arrow function, and then expect sum of 1 and 2 to be 3. What do you guys notice first thing off of that? It looks like just like the code you've most likely been writing for Jasmine and Mocha. Like there's no like major syntactical difference here. I'm not having to relearn a whole new way of writing tests. I can pretty much just write tests the way I always write them. So with this, to run the test, one of the easiest things to do is just go ahead and in my package JSON, add a scripts, in my script section, add test to just run test. And then bada boom, it's just going to run. And when I run npm test, we're great. If I want to be able to run it directly from the command line, I just need to do an npm install global on Jest, and now I have that available on the global. But let's take a look. Actually, before we get to the output here, I'm going to swing over here, and let's take a look at running the test. Well, if I get the right window, actually, that's a little small. All right, is that a little better? You guys see it in the back? You good? All right. All right, so I'm going to do just sum, and we'll just leave it at that. So most of the time here that it'll spend is doing some transpiling here. But what we have for our output is.
Look for a file the name of Sum.
Oh, see, that's one of the beautiful things here that right out of the package is that I can go ahead and filter it down so it only runs the tests that match this file name pattern. Okay, I don't have to go run all the tests. I can just very easily and quickly be able to filter it down. Now, if let's say I wanted to do the npm test, but I wanted to be so that I could run sum. Again, all I have to do is just dash dash, and that basically escapes me back into append that onto it, and it would run it the same exact way. So you can run it either way. It's very, very simple. Let's take a look at the output here really quick. We started to get into that slide. But this is pretty standard output from a karma test. And who's ever had to deal with ones where you feel like you're swimming towards the top and you're trying to get back up to the very first one? Yeah, you know, you're having to sit there and scroll through to try to find what went wrong, and then I get this beautiful stuff here. App component should have a title, app failed, expected app, and this big, you know, stack trace here for me to kind of dig through. Or my other option here is I can get a test output like this on a failure.
That's pretty nice.
It works really, really nice here. Hey, here's the line number. All right, here's where things are going wrong. I know my exact test. I know what my expected is. I know what my received is. I don't have to dig through these big stack traces and try to figure out what's going on. So usually when I'm doing karma tests, I'm always scrolling all the way back up to the top, because usually it's whatever's going on at the top will cause cascading issues down through the rest of it. So I usually start at the top one and work my way, you know, down through the list. But it's really kind of arduous with using karma. It's like probably the one rub that I can say is like, God, this is hard, but this is easy. This is like kind of fun. Like I can work with this, right? So code coverage, let's talk about that really quick. So we were talking about Istanbul briefly there, and we'll come over here and just run just some coverage. And now I get code coverage on my sum. I've got 100%. Let me just make this a little bigger. So you can see here on my sum, 100% on the statements, 100% on the branch, 100% on the functions, the lines. Does it have, this is just part of an error in the configuration, but the uncovered line is 10.
I know, I write it all the time.
And it tells me what,
It's so stupid to get rid of this stuff.
that tells me what line number that issue's on with that component. That actually should not be included because that's actually our setup piece. So that just needs to be configured correctly. So the point there, though, is that we're easily able to get code coverage. I didn't have to go install Istanbul. I didn't have to get it configured. And hey, this is the output that I want. Super simple to work with. So again, there's our code coverage.
So even though you ran the test for some, it did the coverage for the entire application, or just that one?
No, it only covers like using the if you put app in front of it, if you're using Karma, it will just run that one test. It's like a weird hack. But it screws up the coverage because it'll only generate the coverage for that particular touch, which is the thing that sucks about Istanbul in general. I can talk about that for hours.
Yeah, it covered two. It only actually covered 2 files here. I'm not sure why it's pulling in setup Jest.
It's a pain in the ass to get rid of the files, man. Regex, you have to like pass Istanbul, tell them north there, like the mocks and all this different stuff.
Yeah, and I'm not sure we got the same problem because we're not using Istanbul here, but we could take a look at what's causing that. All right.
No coverage is written to a file.
It is not by default, but I believe you can get it to write to a file. Yeah. All right, so let's talk about some of the CLI options here. So we looked at how to do coverage. We can, as well as how we can filter test files down to the ones that just match what we're looking for. The other one that we haven't covered yet is watch. And so watch is a super powerful command line option here that allows us to not run the full suite of tests. So let's say you had a project, we've got 1,000 tests, and you've got only 2 that are failing, but it takes like 30 seconds to rerun them to get back to the ones that are failing, right? And it's just like mind-blowing, like how much time I'm having to waste. Even if I've got it in the auto run mode, I gotta wait for it to run back. Oh, it's still not right. You know, make a change, it runs through again. Oh, it's still not right, and you're struggling with that. So watch mode is super powerful. With the watch usage, once I use the -s watch, can press, once it's run, now I've got the ability to say, hey, run all tests again. press F to run only the failed tests. So by default, Jest is going to start out with the failed tests first versus running the entire suite. In Karma, you don't have the option. It's just going to run the list of tests. And who's actually done it where you do the exit or the F it? You know, and you put either the X or the F in front of them of all these different tests, and then you accidentally check it in, and only 3 tests are running in production now, you know, or to get the production build out, and it was just because I forgot to take it off. Well, I don't have to do any of that. It does support some of those commands. We'll take a look at what all the globals are in Jest that you can do. But the other thing you can do here is watch mode will help us with snapshots. But we haven't talked about snapshots yet. So the example I've given you is as close as to what you already know, what you're already working with. And this is not the powerful part of Jest, but this is the digestible part of Jest that we can talk about initially before we start digging into NgRx. So Jest globals, these should look really familiar. After each, before all, before each, describe. I can do describe only, describe skip. We've got some stuff here on our mocks. And then test only, test skip. You know, so slightly different syntax on these two and these two, but the rest of it's pretty standard stuff. We've all seen most of this, right? All right, so let's start digging in here, because as much as we'd like to say that we write tests for functions like sum, that's just not reality. We're writing tests for much more complicated stuff. And we start looking at NgRx, and we're developing these Redux applications. And when I first started doing it, it's like, I don't even know where to begin. How do I properly test these? What's the right way here? So here I've got a really simple action class. So I'm going to export a class called select. It implements action. Its type is the customer actions type.select. And then I've got my constructor here, which I'm setting in the public payload of customer, right? Pretty simple. Who's writing these type of Redux classes, action classes? Anybody? A couple of you. Let's even take a step back. Who's writing Redux right now? NgRx. Okay, one more person. All right. So we're going to dig into this, even though you may not have done Redux yet. Hopefully this will help talk you into it, and you'll see how simple it is to write this type of code, and understanding really the main premise here and why you would move a project towards NgRx or the Redux pattern is to reduce complexity. If you're not reducing complexity, don't do it. The problem that we're seeing in the industry is that people will choose to do NgRx on a really simple application because it seems like it'd be fun. Seemed like a good idea. It does introduce a certain level of complexity and a certain level of understanding that you're going to have to be able to maintain this and do it properly. So I think the really simple rule of thumb here is if you're not reducing complexity, maybe you should just keep it as a CLI project until you're ready for that. And the beautiful thing with Redux is that it's not an all or nothing. You can actually just take and implement Redux just in the areas that are complicated, and the rest of the app can still be just a regular old CLI app. All right, so we've got a simple class here. We want to be able to write a test for it. So the test that I want to be able to do here is when I get the action of select, it should set the selected ID. Okay, and so this is actually a little bit premature because the selected ID doesn't actually happen until the reducer, but so it's really actually slightly misnamed of what it should be. But in this case here, I'm going to go ahead and create a customer object. It's got an ID of 1 and a name of test user, and then an action equals a new customer action select, and I'm passing that customer object into it. So that's the payload. If you didn't catch it, that's the payload that we defined here, right? That's what we're passing in for the select. So we're passing that customer in, and then we're expecting the action type to be customer select, and we're expecting the action payload to be the customer. It's a really simple class. There's not a whole lot of magic here. It'd be like testing any other class and making sure that any public defined variables that would then be available after the constructor is called, that they would be set correctly, as well as checking a public type. So let's take a look at the code here really quick for an action, and maybe this will come together a little bit more for you. Probably don't need that to be quite so big now. All right. And actually, we'll start over here on the model really quick. I've got a customer model later. All right, so we got our export interface customer. It just has ID and name. So really simple interface. Wanted to keep that really simple for this example. And then over here, we've got an enum for our action types. So what does customer support? It supports load, load success, load fail, and select. So the one that I was concentrating on is select here. And then down at the bottom here, I've got my select class. This is the one that we just looked at in our example. And then we have our test for it. Customer select should set the, oh, I changed it over here. Should set the payload to customer. So any questions on this? Does this make sense? Okay. So pretty simple test here on how to test actions. Let's get back over here. Great. I thought that was the next slide. So let's talk about snapshots. Because what I've shown you so far is a standard, hey, we're going to execute this, and I'm going to expect this to be this value, right? The problem with that sort of thinking when I'm writing tests is that when I do a refactor, now all of a sudden, when those rules change, I'm going to have to go change a lot of tests. It could be 200 tests that have, different types of now returns. Maybe we decide our sum function, 2 + 1 is now 4. For our application, it's special, right? But what if we didn't have to do that? What if we could do things a little differently? And that's where snapshots come into play. And this is the real power of why you should consider using Jest in your applications. So they compare expectations to a stored snapshot. When I first heard this, I was like up in arms. I was like, you cannot take anything that's an output from a test and put it into the repo. It breaks every rule of what I've been taught, but this is what you're going to do. You're going to store that off so we can compare it later. We're going to store it off because you might make some changes or you might make some changes. And when I go to run the test, I need your snapshot of what it was based off what you're expecting it to be. So the nice thing here is I don't have to create the snapshots. So I don't have to go out, and it's not like a mock where I'm like, okay, I need a mock, so I got to code up a mock, and I've got to maintain the mock. No, it will create the snapshot if it doesn't exist automatically, and it will assume that it is correct. And it's up to you to go out and check it. So you go out, and we'll take a look at what the snapshots look like. They're very readable. They look exactly like your objects. They look exactly like your HTML. They look exactly like your JSON. So they're super simple to work with. What's nice about snapshot testing is they perform a diff on the snapshot, just like you're looking at a GitHub or a Git diff between what the code was and what it is now, and looking at the diff and comparing, you get the same diff. So it's very easy, very natural for us as developers that work with Git to be able to look at this and go, hey, okay, I can see what changed. It'll also just truncate a whole bunch of the stuff that's the same. If it's a really big output, it'll truncate the rest of it if the rest of it matches. So I don't have to sit there and dig through massive logs. It's easy to update the snapshots on refactor. So we talked about the watch mode earlier. What's great about the watch mode is it will tell me that, hey, the snapshots no longer match. What would you like to do? And there's basically two options. There's the all in, I'm in Vegas, I'm going to roll the dice, and I'm going to hit you, and let's just update it all. I wouldn't recommend it, but you have that option. There's also the interactive mode where it'll go test by test by test, and I can decide, hey, do I want this one to be updated? No, let's skip that one. Let's go on to the next one so that I can get down to the ones, get the ones that I know, like, yep, that's correct. Yep, I expected that change. I can get through those quickly, and then I can focus on the ones that are my problem ones. So imagine if you have 200 of these, but most of them you look at and go 175 of them are ones that, yeah, okay, I'm totally cool with this. Yep, we made these changes. Yep, those look like the HTML changes I made. Yep, that looks like the data change that I made. And then I can focus on the 25 that are my real issues instead of having to dig with them and deal with them all at the same time. So let's talk about a snapshot test example. So here we've got our select again. So should set customer to payload and snapshot. I went ahead and moved the customer definition, I think, up somewhere else. And I'm going to expect the action payload to match the snapshot. So I don't actually have to tell it what it's going to equal. It's going to look up the snapshot and go, hey, does this, I'm going to do a diff on it, and hey, are these the same thing, or are these different? And if they're different, it's going to give me some feedback. So let's take a look here really quick. So there's that definition. Here is our test right here. Match snapshot. Oh, so kind of funny story. How did I learn about snapshots? I'm digging through the NgRx example app code, and all of a sudden I see this folder called __ snapshot. What's this thing? And I'm like, oh, this is, I don't know what this is. And I was digging around a little bit more, and then I start searching for snapshots, and I find Jest, and I'm like, oh, started learning and digging around, and so it was really by accident that I learned about it. Because I'm not, at first, I haven't heard a whole lot about Jest testing with Angular. Because really, this is a React thing. This is a Vue thing. But this is something that's been, it's well written and written open enough that we can use it in Angular, and we can take advantage of this. And so we're starting now to see a little bit of traction. We're starting to see people start to use this. We are using this on all of our projects right now. Why? Because we can do it faster and better. It's going to be easier to maintain long term, and the tests run faster, a lot faster. So let's take a look at the snapshot here really quick. So let's see here. Okay, so here we go. Customer actions. Well, let's load customers. Where's select customers? Here's the select one. Customer actions. Customer select should set payload to customer. Object, ID 1, name, test. Yeah, that looks great. Perfect. Very readable. It's not like it's some foreign format that, or it's XML or, something crazy that I've got to sit there and really spend a lot of time looking at. It's pretty natural. I can look at it and go, yeah, hey, that looks like what I'm expecting.
Part of source control.
Pardon me?
It's part of source control.
Yeah, it goes into your source control, goes into get, it's going to get checked in. So when we go to run this build up in the stage environment, it knows that, hey, the snapshot that we're still expecting should be exactly this. If it's not, then we got a problem. Yep, go ahead.
When you get questions, can you repeat them? It's a little hard to hear.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Will do. Will do. I got to think about that. All right. So you can see with snapshots, I no longer have to set up my to be this or to equal this, or all those go away. Now, it might not always make sense to use to match snapshot, but I think in most scenarios it does. It actually makes it really, really easy, especially when we start getting into refactors, to be able to compare our diffs about what's really changing versus trying to figure out what I wrote 6 months ago and why did I have that logic set up the way that I did about that assertion. All right, so
You're basically assuming that what actually happened in the test is what's supposed to happen unless you say otherwise.
so the question is that I'm assuming. Say that again.
So it's weird because the snapshot gets generated when you run the test, I'm assuming?
Yes.
Okay, so you'll run, like say you change some logic and then you rerun the test and it changes your snapshot. You're looking at this diff.
So let's clarify. So the question is how the snapshot's updated basically, and when we're running the test. So once it's generated, once you run the test the first time and there's no snapshot, and I've called done the comparison of snapshot compare, it's going to go ahead and create the snapshot for me. The second time through, I run it and it's changed. It doesn't change anything. It throws an error. It says, hey, we have a problem. Snapshots no longer match. What do you want to do? So you as a user still have control as a developer. What do I want to do here? Do I want to go ahead and accept the new snapshot, or do we have a problem and I got to figure out why the old snapshot changed?
Doesn't understand type changes. So object, if ID went from a number to a GUID, which would be a string in TypeScript, would it know?
So the question was, would it catch type changes if it went from a string to a number? Yes, it would. It might not get, let's say, from a string. Well, actually, I think in all cases that I'm thinking of here for this, yes, it would. So the ones I'm thinking, if it goes from a number to a string, it's no longer going to match. If it goes from a number to a GUID or a string to a GUID, it's not going to match. So could you possibly find a scenario? I don't know, maybe. But for the most part, it should catch it, because if you're changing types, you're probably changing your value as well fairly significantly. So
the second time you create a snapshot, it doesn't match, and then you just say, okay, roll the dice, go ahead and like have this override. You basically are saying that all of my to match snapshot tests pass.
So the question is when they start failing, if I press, you have two options when they start. If your snapshots fail, you can do the, hey, roll the dice, it's Vegas, we're just going to hit you and it's going to update all of them. Or you go into an interactive mode and you're going to step through them one at a time. Or you can go back and do it manually if you want. You don't have to, you have the option of making the edits yourself or going back and fixing the test or whatnot. But yeah, you can do it either way.
I can just see like a junior developer or somebody who just doesn't have time. Like, whatever, I don't want to deal with these, just update all of them.
That's, yeah, so that's a good point. This is going to show up in your PR.
Yeah.
This is going to get checked in. I'm going to see this. And then as a senior developer, I'm going to look at it and go like, I don't know what this person's thinking. Yeah, I'm going to reject this. I'm going to kick it back.
Let's be honest, we've all been there, like, whatever.
It's time to go home, baby.
So, all right.
Why would you do that?
So let's get into something a little bit more complicated. Let's talk about a reducer. So the purpose of a reducer is to take our existing state and replace it with a new state, right? Our state is immutable, and so it's really, to me, this is probably one of the more important ones to test is the reducer. Making sure that I understand if I start with this state and I give it this state, that the expected state's coming out the way that I want. And for me, this is the matching makes it a lot easier on the snapshots than it is to try to build out objects, and especially when we're starting to talk about entity. So this is where we're going to talk very briefly about NgRx entity. So the data that you get back from your API is typically array data, right? Most cases you're getting array data. You might get a single object, but most cases we're getting array data. I'm getting a list of customers. I'm getting a list of products. Great. The problem here is nested data. And then being able to unnest data and be able to do references between, let's say, customers and products, customers and orders. Okay, so I could easily take orders and put them underneath customers. And I can take products and place those in the store underneath orders, right? And then I'd have products over here, and then I'd change the name of the product, but it doesn't update the product on the order anymore because it's two different copies of the same data. My reducers become very, very complex because I've got to now go find all the records that have that product that you just updated over here, and I got to go find in every possible store that it might be in. You feel the pain that you might be up against here? So the Redux.js org spec is that do not nest data. There are times where you may not have a choice. And I can think of one such example, and it's basically a bit stream that we're getting down from a client from an IoT device. And we just bit the bullet with that and said, okay, look, we know what the cost is, and this is how we're going to handle it. But 99% of the time, you do not want to nest that data. You want to actually take anything like customers, orders, products, and move them to first-class citizens, if you will, within the store. So they're top-level entities. They're not nested within each other, but then now I have a new problem.
No, on client side, right?
Yes, we're talking about the client-side NgRx store. The problem we run into then is if I want to find all the orders for this customer, and I got to do it over 1,000 customers.
What are you calling server?
No, there's actually some other ways that we can do this. We're not going to have to call the server. We just need to look at the data a little differently. So instead of putting it into array data, we're going to move it to a dictionary data. Okay, dictionary, the ID or the key is the ID. So I have a customer ID of 1, that'll be the key is 1, and then the value will be the actual customer object. This way I can make referential pseudo integrity by referencing the ID of 1 for that customer, and now I can go look him up very, very quickly. I don't have to go and filter over an array multiple times, which would be highly inefficient, which would then mean a call back to the server if I had to go that route. But instead, by going to dictionary data, I can resolve that. The point here is that the NgRx entity library does this for you. You don't have to worry about converting it from array data to dictionary data. And it also supplies you with selectors that will convert it from dictionary data back to array data. Very, very fast, very, very efficient. And from a developer perspective, it's actually less work in my mind. So we'll take a look at that briefly as well. So we've got a reducer here. And the reducer function by itself, it takes in a state, and it defaults to an initial state, and then its action is a customer actions. And then it returns a state. So on that, we're going to switch on the action type, and we're going to check on the action type for select. In our case here, we're going to, again, we're in an object here versus an array. So if we were using array-based data, like what we're getting back from the API, you would see, square brackets for an array. But instead, what we're going to do is we're going to use an object here, and we're going to go ahead and spread the existing state, which we'll take a look at a quick example what state looks like. And then we're going to then merge it with setting the selected customer ID to be the action payload ID. So actions are select class, right? That we defined earlier. We've already tested this. The payload is the customer, and the ID is the value that we want off of it. And we're going to set it here onto the selected customer ID. All right, so let's take a quick, I know you guys don't have as much Redux experience, so I'm going into a little bit more depth than what I usually would, because I want you to understand this a little bit, because we're testing these, and then I want you to see the value of Jest. And to do that, I feel like you have to understand just a little bit more about Redux to do so. So on the reducer here, we actually have lots of different methods. So the initial one here, we've got like load. The only thing we're going to do is we're just going to return the existing state. We're going to set loading to true, and we're going to set the selected customer ID to null.
Can you close that panel?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
It's kind of hard to follow.
Is that better?
Yeah.
All right. But we're going to need that panel right back. Actually, I do want to show you this really quick here. Let's look at a snapshot, because I want you to see what the state looks like. So this is our customer store. Now, the two standard properties when we're dealing with NgRx entity is what are the entities? That is the dictionary. And then I have the IDs, which is an array. That can be either of string or of numeric array. This is the natural order that we'd want our entities to display in. So that's the order that they came to us in, or that we presently have them sorted in. And then the entities here is our dictionary, and that's going to have all of them. So you think about it, if our IDs were GUIDs, and they're coming from Mongo or Firebase, something like that, then there's no natural order for those, right? They're just, if we're trying to do alphabetical, they're going to be in the wrong order from how we got them down from the server. That's why we have the IDs array here, and that just holds like, hey, here's the order that we're going to want to display them back into, and we're going to use this to, with the selectors, to basically rebuild it back to array data. These other three properties, error, loading, and selected customer ID, those are custom properties that we added, which is also a feature of NgRx entity. And that's how you can add a few things here so that we know, like, hey, do we have an error while loading? Are we actively loading these? and hey, which one is selected. These are technically, when we talk about state within the store, these are technically considered app state. You really have UI state, like, hey, is the sidebar open or is it closed? I have app state, like, hey, are we loading things? Do we have an error condition? And then I have entities. Those are your three major states. But sometimes it makes sense to go ahead and move some of these app states down closer to the level that we're working with, versus having it up in and having to traverse into some sort of other store to find, like, hey, the customers that we're attempting to load, is that loading flag set to true or not? And this just makes it a lot easier. So that said, our select here again, we're just going to come back to this guy. We're going to take the existing state. So it's an object. When we spread it, it's just still an object. Okay. And we're then by doing the spread, then it allows us to go ahead and then merge this property with it, right? It's super simple. And so now we're getting a new state back. So our new state is on a select. We're not changing the state. We're just saying, hey, of all the customer entities that we have, this is the one. This is the ID of the one that's selected now. Okay. So to test that, to test the reducer, we're going to go ahead and create a new action called select. So we've already done this before with the customer. And then we're getting a reference above to our reducer. We're passing the initial state and we're passing the action here. And we're getting that result. So we're going to expect the result to match the snapshot. We just looked at the snapshot, right? That's the actual customer store object. And then the other thing I'm going to do here is I'm actually testing a selector on here to say, hey, from the customer's reducer, get selected ID with the result should equal the customer.id. Or I could say to match snapshot. So I wouldn't have to, if I decide to change the customer ID, because we would never do that, right, in testing, or we decide to change one ID and now so we have to update 200 tests because one little piece of data changed. Copy, paste, yep. All right, so if we go back over here to the code and look at our spec. All right, so here's our initial state. It looks really similar to what we were seeing within the, let me make that just a little bit bigger. This is what we were looking at in the snapshot. Here's, we're setting a customers and customer so we can use them later. And then we go through and we can test each one of our different states or our different actions. So in Redux, you have to define all your actions. What does a customer need to support? It needs to support a load. To say, hey, look, I need to fire off a load. I need to then support, if you think about it, when we call an external service, one of two things is going to happen, right? Things are going to go good, and we're going to assign the list of customers to something, or things are going to go bad, and we're probably going to show a growl or a toaster that, hey, something went wrong. So we need to support both of those. And then in this simple example here, we'd also have one for being able to select. So those are our 4 basic actions. So we have tests for each one of these. And in one, if we have a default that doesn't have any of those actions, that would actually just return the existing state. So again, I think it helps to be able to look at the snapshots and see. Most of these actually just got set to snapshot. So let's say here on, get rid of that, the customer reducer load customers fail action should add error to the state. What I want to see here is that this is actually getting set. Does that look correct? Yes, that looks correct to me. We're getting an error. I want to make sure that when we have the error action, the load fail action, that it's going to go ahead and set the error. Because in Redux, you have to think about it like this. Every single thing that happens, whether it be a user interaction or a system interaction, is a new state. We need to be able to time travel all the way through the states, frontwards and backwards. Because they're basically everything is deterministic. Based on this state, the app is going to render out the same exact way every single time. All right. So let's jump over to, does anyone have questions on reducers? Anything that's like,
I have a question.
yeah, go ahead.
On your test, you just call snapshot. And then I guess, so does it use just step typing to figure out which object how does it know that?
Oh, for the, when we call, okay, I see what your question is. So the question is when we call to snapshot in multiple times in the same test.
If it's a true class, not an
Um,
interface, smart rehydrate to the original class, because that class may have behaviors that are different than the interface.
No, that's why, I don't know if you noticed there, but what it's doing is it's got a 1 and a 2 after each one. And if it has a second one, then it's putting the numeric in there. I believe that's what it's using to say, hey, that's the second one, use this one. And I actually think it's based off the number of assertions. So the number of expects versus the number of times that to match snapshot is being. So it's using the name here, undefined action, should return the default state. That's part of the name. That's the key, right? But it's also then appending a 1 and a 2 at the end of that based on the number of expects, I believe.
Does that make the test fragile? Because then now the snapshot is based on the name of the scribe and the actual test name.
So the question is whether or not that makes the test fragile. Yeah, I can see how that could potentially cause some problems. I'm not sure if it's got a way that it's checking to see, hey, do I have a different one, different numbered version one that actually matches, and that's what's happened. I'm not sure. That's a good question though. Yep, absolutely.
Things that violate QA.
Absolutely. Does that answer your question? Are you good? All right. So next thing we're going to talk about is effects. Is anyone using effects currently right now? So effects are really just simply anything that's an asynchronous action needs to be handled with an effect. Okay, so if we're getting data from a database, then it's asynchronous. We want to go ahead and have that be handled by an effect. And so the idea here is very simply that an action is going to start it. So when I call customers load action, it's going to say, hey, let's fire off the service. It's not saying, hey, I've got data back. That's a separate action. That'll be the load success action. And if it fails, it'll be the load fail action. So if we take a look at an example of an effect here, I think it makes really good sense. Go ahead and get rid of this. So basically, we have it decorated with the effects class, or the effect function. And then over here, it's listening for a customer action load, okay? So the customer action load is what it's listening for. And when that happens, it's going to go ahead and call a switch map, which will get basically any query parameters that we might need for this. We don't have any query parameters for this one in particular, but it will go ahead and call the customer's service load function.
So it goes out of band, right?
Pardon me?
So it goes out, makes the call, comes back.
Well, it's since this is an observable, so the question is what happens when it makes a call? Yes, it goes out, it makes a call to whatever your API is, and then it's going to then pipe the results. When that observable emits a new event or new value, then it's going to go ahead and pipe that to one of these two here. So catch error is kind of a unique one here. Basically, any error happens, it's going to go ahead and pick that up. So I don't have to have the two separate functions. I guess in a way you sort of do, but you know, on an observable, we'd have you know, we go ahead and subscribe to it, and we'd have the success function and the fail function, right? In this case here, here's our success. We're going to go ahead and map customers, which is a type customer array, to a new load success. And it's passing those customers in. On a catch error, we're just going to call, we're going to create a new observable and with a new action here called load fail and pass the error. So what's actually happening here in Redux is the reducer is actually picking up both of these then. It's going to go ahead and pick up the load success and the load fail, and those are actually happening back over in the reducer code that we just looked at. So to give you a quick look at that, on load success, we're going to use the adapter. The adapter is part of the entity. library, and we're going to call a function called add mini. We're going to take the payload, which is the array of customers, and we're going to append it to the existing state. Pretty simple. The add mini here, that's what puts it in dictionary form. This is the function call that I use if I want to go ahead and then put it to the dictionary. On the fail over here, I'm going to take the existing state, and I'm going to spread it, and I'm going to append it with error message, error loading customer data, or error loading customers.
The pizza is late. We normally have it before, but if you guys want to grab pizza, just like sneak it over there quietly.
Just smart enough to return to actually check the type of the objects being returned to make sure it's not being cast as a different type.
So the question is it smart enough to check type checking on the reducer functions? Is that the question? Yes. When you look at some implementations of Redux, they'll actually just be passing around strings for the instead of the customer action types enum, or let's say if you're just using pure JavaScript, you're not getting any type checking at all. The beauty of using TypeScript with Redux is that I do get all the type checking. All the payloads are verified. So I don't accidentally pass a number where it's expecting a customer, and now I'm starting to get this really bizarre error, and I don't understand why, right? So yeah, that's just one of the beauties of TypeScript, of picking that up. So going back over here to the entity, so looking at this now, or entity, the effect. When looking at the effect here, this is all great, but how do you test a function that calls action $pipe? Like, how do we even set something like this up so that it would work correctly? Well, this is like a really big mystery to me when I first started writing this. Like, wow, I got to figure out, I got to get an observable to emit this action, then it'll call the deal, and when that gets done, I'm going to then create a new action. It just seemed a little like, how am I supposed to do this? So introducing marbles, which I think we're going to, at a later date, hear a little bit more about marbles here, but let's take a look at the test code here really quick, and this will muddy the water plenty for you, I think. It did for me initially. So basically now, I'm declaring an action, which is the load. That's the one I want to watch for. And then I have a completion, which is a load success. That's what I hope I get to, right? Then I got a response cold, an expected cold, and an action stream hot. And then a whole bunch of stuff that I didn't understand what was going on. And then the example that I saw initially had a lot more dashes. It looked more like this. Some stuff like that. And then I was doing snapshot comparisons on it. It was telling me that time frame 30 didn't match time frame 70. And I'm like, I don't understand what's going on. Well, it turns out I didn't understand marbles. So it took a little bit of digging around and looking up RxJS marbles, looking up Jasmine marbles, to figure out what I needed to do here. So the really simple thing is this. One, a hot goes ahead and is instantly turned on, and will go ahead, before the test even runs, it will go ahead and start emitting this action here. This action is the load, okay? And so that's what if you remember, in our effect, we're waiting to hear for a load action to be emitted, right? And so that goes ahead and does the emit on our actions stream, okay? And so this is an object that literally does point to this guy here. And then I've got two different things that I want to have happen. One, I need the service to respond with data, would be really nice. So I go ahead and declare the response to be a cold. So this acts more like let me get this right, it's subject, is that right? I believe. Yeah. And it basically acts as a subject, and it doesn't fire off until the test actually starts. And what it's going to do is then return customers. Well, if you notice, this response here is also used down here. So instead of having to write out a big old mock or doing a whole bunch of spy stuff that we'd usually be used to, I can just say, hey, on the customer's service.load, just use Jest function. Use a big arrow function here and just return the response. We're done. So that there just mocked out my call. And now I'm returning the data that I want to return, which is customers, which is defined up above, has an array of a single customer in it. Yeah, go ahead.
Just.fn, is it going to call subscribe on this response internally?
The question is whether Jest.fn, that function, was going to subscribe. I don't think so, but I'm not sure. That's a good question. Basically, my understanding here is it's creating a mock. It's replacing, I mean, really what we're doing is we're replacing the load function on the customer's service, and we're replacing that load function with a new function. And so that is going to return an observable. So it's pointing to the response. The response is a cold observable. So, it's a subject. It's going to go ahead and, it's going to emit on that. And so it's going to go ahead and fire. We'll talk about this in a second. The pipe basically says now turn it off. So go ahead and emit the customers and then turn it off. Call completion on the observable. Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we got to understand about RxJS marbles, and we're just going to cover like a really small bit of it in like 30 seconds or less. All right.
Show what the declaration for actions and services looks like.
Okay, so the question is if I can show what the definitions for actions and customer service is. Absolutely.
I'm curious as to what the document.
Sure. That's the customer service one's a little easier to show you. That's really simple. It's a get. It's got an API path, and the interesting thing is it's not even wired to an API. There's no such API for this application. I don't need it because I'm mocking out that function anyway for my test. So even if it did get through, it would just fail because there is no endpoint. There is no endpoint for this.
I've seen this pattern of people using the string $sign. What they do is they take the behavior subject and return it as an observable. Try to keep it from like injecting in, like actually calling.
I'm not sure that applies to this, but that is one thing I've seen before. Yeah, let's take a look at the stream code here really quick. So the action, there's, oh, let's see here. Effects. So actions is actually defined from the from testbed get actions, and actions here is provided, and then has a we're just replacing this with a get actions, and get actions is defined up here, which creates a new test actions, which has it extends actions and has a stream property on it. Okay. And so the stream property allows us to go ahead and set a source for it. So that's where that's coming from. So there's a little bit of black magic that's going on here, if you will, of, underneath the covers, like, hey, yeah, we've got this test actions piece, and we're able to set the stream on it. Again, it's extending actions, right? And actions is coming from the effects library directly.
Okay, yeah. Again, I don't deviate from marbles. I just wanted to make
sure. Sure, absolutely. So let's come back over here really quick. So based off of what we've done here, we've set up our test so that we can watch for the load. We can then mock out the service so that it returns the customers that we want, and then we can have it have the overall completion. We should probably go look at that again. The completion of it. So we're calling effects load, and for it to match the snapshot. So it'll pick up, it'll watch for the load, and then at the end we're going to match the snapshot of the interesting. Something here with the expected. I think actually this one's got a problem. Oh, okay. So there's two different ways of doing this. That's what it is. Let's one of the ways that I can write this is that I can expect on effects load to be an observable of the expected, and the expected being an error. That'd be a load fail observable with an error. So I didn't use a to-snapshot here, and we'll take a look at one of the reasons why. And it's partly because I haven't implemented a serializer with this yet, so we're kind of getting really off track here. But the idea here is that the effect returns another observable, right? Of an action, and then that action then is going to get picked up by the reducer, right? So in our case here, we're having an error. This is the error path. So we're talking about what other things you can do with some of the symbols like pipe. Well, pound is basically just fail it in this time frame. And so our response from the service in this case here is going to be an error. So remember before we were returning a list of customers, and then our expected is our completion. Our completion here is defined as just a new load fail with an error in it. Okay, because that's what we're going to expect that it would return. We go ahead and set our stream to be the action of load. We go ahead and mock out the service to return the response, which is the error. And now when we go ahead and call effects load, we're going to expect to be an observable with a load error. So that's the way of doing it with where I'm not using a snapshot. And the reason that we did it, I want to show you guys both of these examples here, is because the snapshot on a observable is quite large. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in here. We got our scheduler, and then buried way down deep in here, I've got two values. Okay, so this is not real intuitive. So what I'd probably want to do here is create a serializer so that I can serialize what gets captured, because all the observable stuff I don't care about. But what I do care about is that it got the two records that I thought it should get, right?
You may want to know, in a very weird edge case, you might want to have a specific state for the actual. But in general, it's going to be too hard to test that. If
you wanted to, so the question is around if you wanted to, you may have it's more of a statement, I should say. If you wanted to compare the actual observable and different states on the observable, then it might be a good idea. Again, the problem is just the size of it and being able to verify it. It's quite large. It's going to be a little bit harder to work with. And even in that case, I would suggest that you would then write a serializer for it that would allow you to get it pared down to just the fields you care about, not the entire piece. So
just goes in the pipeline.
That just goes in the pipeline. I don't understand.
So with serializer, you just say serialize as.
Basically, there's for the questions around the serializers. With serializers, there's a defined way of defining. Yeah, there's an example of how you do them, and you can go ahead and within that function, you can go ahead and pare things down to whatever you want it to be. So I could create one just for observables, and then I can say, hey, on this test, I want to apply this serializer, this snapshot serializer to this test, and it would go ahead and pare that down based off whatever rules I set up within that function. That way it wouldn't return the whole thing. So there's definitely some great examples out there. It's less common, so I didn't really want to get too far into that tonight. So this is great. We've looked at, we can test out our reducers, we can test out our actions, we can test out our effects. We even tested out briefly there, if you caught it, on the select, one of our selectors. So we've been able to test out the four major things within a Redux project. The other thing I want to leave you with here is that you can do a little bit more than this as well. Let's take a look at actually, let me just collapse all that. Let's go look at a container here. So containers, really the idea in Redux with a container is it's usually like a page level object or component. You can have containers be subpage components, but it's usually then to manage some of the complexity of something that's reusable and be able to move it down a level out of the main page. But here I've got a customer's container, This is purely just generated code, no big deal there. And I didn't make any changes here to the component itself, but I did make a couple changes here for the, actually right here on line 26. So I added a test that says it should render the markup to a snapshot. So I go ahead and expect the fixture to match the snapshot. All right, so let's go take a look at the snapshot really quick here. Again, this is just out of the box, plain generated component, but you can see it went ahead and captured my HTML for me. So you're like, oh, well, that's great. Awesome, right? But this isn't really a real awesome example because there's nothing going on here. There's no data. There's nothing being injected. There's nothing to really verify here. I mean, I could verify and make sure this doesn't change. I can go ahead and come in here and change the template and it'll complain about it, right? But where the value is over here. I went ahead and created a component also called customers. And oh, let's drop that part out. We don't need that. That was called debugging code. I went ahead and modified the interface. It has a customer's input. And that customer's input, we're going to go ahead and loop over it and then just list each out the customer's names in a unordered list, right? Pretty simple code here. No big deal. On the object, or the component here, I have my input. It's expecting an array of customer objects, and that's going to be assigned to customers. And then so on my test, what I can do, here's, again, all this is pretty standard stuff. I didn't make any changes here. It should be able to create it. I want to see it if I don't do anything with it, what is the snapshot? It shouldn't, basically the name of this should be, it shouldn't render any customers. And in the other one here, I'm going to go ahead and set component customers equal to a customer, and then call fixture to check changes so that it goes ahead and picks up that change. And then I'm going to expect the fixture to match the snapshot. Now this is where it gets a little more powerful. Here on this one where it just renders the markup, there's no customers, it doesn't render anything. All right, we've already seen that. That's no big deal. But here, now I start to see, okay, yep, it got an array, and from that array, as we looped over, we got an object, and then I got my LI customer test. So now what I can do is I can really start to test out my UI components to make sure they're rendering the way that I expect. And I don't have to do it using an end-to-end tool like Protractor. So the thing about Redux is this, is that if I give you a given state, you as a component have to render the same way every single time, no exception. It's deterministic. It's the beauty of Redux. It's why we're storing every action that's happening, every change in the state, whether it be, again, system, user, whatever. You know, I'm clicking on something, the system loads something, it's logging another action. Okay, and that's what allows us to go forward and backwards in time travel. And so the point here is that we can now take and give it a given state, and I can test out and make sure, hey, does this validate the way that I think it should? I can go ahead, imagine I've got this customer's page, and it's got all these fields on it, and it's got all these validators. Now, can you imagine in a Protractor situation, I gotta go through one by one and click, and then probably refresh the page or go back a page, come back to the page, you know, and I want to test each validator individually and then want to test them in together. What if I could actually just go in and say, hey, here's my object. Go ahead and, here's my customer object. Go ahead and pass it into it as an input to my customer form here. And I can then go ahead and set the form to validate. And now I can see which ones actually show up. Does it do it the way that I want? I can go manually just check, yeah, okay, yep, that rendered exactly the way I want. Now that I've got my snapshot set, if all of a sudden you come along and decide, you know, you're not going to pay attention to validation, and you go and make a bunch of changes, nothing's going to pass anymore. Hopefully it doesn't just hit you, which literally will be me having to go through and then looking at the pull request and going like, oh, what went wrong here? Looks like we changed a bunch of these. No, this doesn't look right. So very powerful to be able to do. This is a technique that we've been doing for a while. That's a variation on it. We didn't have the snapshot aspect, but we were always taking components and we were dropping them onto just by themselves onto a blank HTML and then testing it only from the HTML side. So that we wouldn't have to go, like in Protractor, the problem is this, is that a lot of times for me to see all the different ways that my component needs to work, I have to set up magic data. Does anyone know what magic data setup looks like? Anyone do that? Where you got to come over here in the product side and set up a product a certain way. So when I come over here on a customer and the customer selects that product, that it shows those other magical fields that don't usually show up, right? And before you know it, yeah, your half hour of end-to-end tests now take 4 hours to run because there's all this crazy magical data setup that has to occur. And usually we're having the Protractor tool set it up for us, right? We're gonna log in, I'm gonna go over products, I'm gonna go change, create a product, it's got this stuff the way I want, and I'm gonna come over here, find the customer, select him, go search for the product, and then I'm gonna validate that it renders the way that I want it. Well, now I can actually say, forget all that. Here's the object, here's a component, marry them together, output it to the snapshot, compare, does that render the way I thought? Yes, it did. Perfect. A lot easier, a lot quicker. The thing to remember here too is these tests are, I think, somewhere like 5 times faster than regular Karma tests. Okay, I mean, they're significantly faster. You'll get a lot more output with them. Also, again, if you have failing tests, those are gonna run first. So you don't have to wait for the whole thing to run to find out whether or not your test is now fixed. Or you can just run just failed tests. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you know much about why Jest is able to run so much faster?
I'm not sure what the reason is yet. I believe it's just the way that it's built. It doesn't seem.
Happens, Keith, when you ask a question, he doesn't know.
Oh, no, it's like.
He's presenting on it next week.
I'm someone's running it faster only with ES6 or types of plastic, or types of pre-shaking. I can guarantee probably with ES5, it's probably not.
I'm not sure what the real reason is on the performance. Just the performance is notably a lot faster. Just a little Jedi mind trick. It's faster.
One other question, I while you're talking about the Protractor, and so one of the things that we tend to do with our Protractor end-to-end tests is when there's a failure, I will take a visual snapshot of that. And so we'll have a reporter that will have a report and this test failed and here's what it actually looked like in the browser. Is there a similar option? I know we saw the DOM in these snapshots, but is there a similar option to actually see what it might look like?
So the question is, with Jest, is do we have a similar construct as like what we can do in Protractor, where we can get a visual of what it looked like in the browser at the time that it failed? Yes, but it's just purely the DOM. No, you don't have any of the CSS and all the other stuff. It's just like, hey, this is the state, and based off the state that we had here, this is what we rendered. And so we'll be able to see that, it's just, without the CSS, it's not going to look, you're not actually going to get the look and feel, but you're going to see the actual elements, what's actually occurring there, right? So just a different paradigm, if you will, on how you approach it. Okay. All right, real quick here, we're going to just touch into RxJS Marbles really quick. Basically, the idea here is it enables asynchronous operations testing in a synchronous and dependable manner. Okay, so imagine trying to do test and effect where we've got, we're going to watch for one observable to emit, and then we're going to call a service, and then mock that out so that we get another observable and wait for that one to resolve, and whether we then pass or fail, and so on and so forth. So RxJS Marbles really helps us solve that. It controls what is emitted and when. We kind of look there, the hot creates a subject that behaves like it's already running before the test even gets going, and the cold creates an observable that starts when the tests actually fire up. In this case here, if we created a hot --A--B, then in frame 30, a 1 would emit, and in frame 60, 2 would emit. It almost sounds like a bowling score, right? We'll get into that in just a second here. On the hot, with a pound, we already saw this. It'll go ahead and emit an error. On frame 40, yes. You got you. I think you're going to be doing a presentation next week, right? So the dashes basically equate time. It's 10 frames of passage of time. It's just, I don't think it actually maps to any direct correlation of time. It's just a way that we can go ahead and have frames that we want things to happen in and compare, did it happen when we thought it was going to happen. The pipe is for completes. That'll go ahead and do the completion on the observable. The pound is just to signal an error. An A is any character. Typically, we use that to then pass in another object. You know, like we were doing before, we say, okay, we're going to return an object with A, and A is the action. You know, like load that we were doing before. And then another one that I'm sure you're going to get into more later on is using parentheses to sync groupings. So we have multiple events emitted on the same exact frame. We can do subscription points with carets, blah, blah, blah. It's a lot in there, and it definitely deserves its own presentation on it. And we already looked at the error path here, and then doing it as observable. Versus the snapshot. And that's pretty much everything for the presentation. So a lot of this here, just to cover the references briefly, these first two are Facebook's GitHub and the GitHub IO website for Jest. Lots of great information, lots of great documentation out there. This here is for TS Jest. This is for us to be able to do TypeScript with Jest. Let's see here. Writing marble tests. This one here from the ReactiveX. This was invaluable. Like that. That's what really helped me figure out what was going on. And then a couple more on marble testing. Yeah, another one on marble testing. So with that, the thing I want to leave you with on Jest is it is changing your paradigm. It's changing how you're writing tests. It's changing away from an expect to be this value or expect to be this object. And that works great, sort of. But when we go to start refactoring, when we go to start working, you know, adding fields or making changes, you know, it kind of gets a little tougher to handle. It's a lot easier to deal with snapshots and be able to look at what the actual output is versus saying, hey, I want to compare, you know, and think about it like this. If you want to compare an object with like 10 different properties, you want to make sure all 10 of those properties got set, you get 10 different expects versus one. The snapshots are automatically created for you, so you don't have to go up and code them yourself. They're updated automatically for you, so you don't have to go out and maintain those. The mocking functionality is amazing. I love it. You know, I've been around with spies and sign-on and creating my own mock objects, and it becomes a full-time job just to maintain the mock objects and the tests, especially as we're doing refactors. So if you're tired of doing tests the same old way and it's kind of getting you down in the I'm just going to start commenting stuff out, take a look at Jest. You save yourself a lot of time, a lot of heartache. And also, I'll just leave you with this. There's a library, I believe, comes with the main Jest library that will help you convert your Jasmine and Mocha straight over to Jest tests, so you don't have to do all the legwork yourself. So with that, thanks so much for coming. Oh, do or don't? Do. Oh, like don't tell them. All right, we'll go back to